A good example of that could be an employment contract. Our country, I'm sure most countries are very litigious by nature now. So if an employee felt that they were wrongly let go 12 years ago and they decided they had a friend who had some other slip and fall law case and because there are groups of people who actually just look for that. So they said, you know what, maybe they really didn't use best practice when they got rid of me. So normally the retention schedule for an employee file with various caveats, but just per se, would be 7 years. But if that person came back in a number of years later and it was still there, then there you go. It's still there, and then the firm could absolutely be in the suit because that document was still there and provided, as opposed to being tossed when it should have been. So again, there's always a paper trail, and the certificate of destruction is the end piece. But as I say, if the document is still there, then it is discoverable and the company would be liable, where they wouldn't have been if they would have followed their procedures.
Welcome to the Hitchhiker's Guide to AI Governance, the podcast for anyone trying to make sense of intelligent machines, messy politics, and everything in between. But don't panic. Today, I stop to give another ride to Phyllis Elin. With decades of senior information governance leadership, Phyllis Elin helps her clients create, deploy, and maintain defensible and cost-saving information governance strategies. Phyllis is based in New Jersey in the United States and has authored or co-authored 4 books and worked within higher education, financial services, manufacturing, healthcare, pharmaceuticals, and public sector services. Phyllis is a renowned expert on information governance, and I'm delighted she could join me again on the Hitchhiker's Guide to AI Governance. G'day, Phyllis.
Hello, Bruce, and thank you so much for inviting me back. I
Yes.
really enjoyed the first discussion that we had, and I'm very happy to be speaking to you again.
Yeah, a little birdie told me you've won an award since we last spoke. Tell us about...
Yeah, I've actually won quite a few awards of late, which is interesting. Most of them revolve around information governance or technology or leadership or having been doing this for such a long time. And one of them actually comes with the addition of being on the Jumbotron yet again in Times Square, which I find so exciting to talk about. And also, I get my award around Christmas time at the Plaza Hotel at a black tie function. So I'm very excited about that. And because of some of these awards, I also get speaking engagements, not only in the States, but also a lot of Asian locations lately for some reason. As you and I have spoken about previously, it takes a long time to actually get entrenched in what you do. And yes, I've been doing this for decades, but I'm finding that recently I'm getting all sorts of additional work and, people, questioning about things, that we might be able to do for them. So considering it's the summertime and the end of the summer at that, I've never been this busy before at this time of year.
Wow. So just run that by me again. You've got a Lifetime Achievement Award from which organization?
The IAOTP, which is the International Association of Top Professionals. I was Information Governance Leader of the Year. I also got a few other additional awards from them and so forth that actually got me to some additional galas, one in Nashville and one in Vegas. And they
Wow.
keep on showering me with awards. This one just came, so that's very exciting. And some of the other ones are from organizations that also are associated with events. So, and again, most of the events are in Vegas, but they're also in other places, such as Dubai and so forth as well.
Great. Well, you did mention that you were going to be on the Jumbotron in Times Square. Well, I don't know if you remember the last time somebody was on a Jumbotron. It was At a concert.
It was at a concert, and those 2 people became very famous,
Yes,
and I guess
and
they said they were not a couple,
mhm,
but things happened to them. They lost positions. I think they lost
mhm,
their relationships. But
yeah,
no, it's just me
yeah.
and the people who were walking underneath the actual billboard at that point. So, no, that won't happen to me.
So it feels like you're capping off a very long career with getting the recognition that you probably always earned.
Yes, but I'm finding that now there's a lot more conferences, there's a lot more accolades, there's a lot more print and electronic media that talks about this. And the intersection of information governance and AI is huge right now. And as I think I've told you previously, I happened to choose an endeavor that saw me through my entire career. I think I mentioned that I actually started out with a PhD in English literature, but also
Mhm.
being a paralegal, it put me into corporate business and records management, which morphed into information governance. And of
Yeah.
course, with the advent of AI, that's such a huge part of what we do day to day now. But one
Mm.
has to be careful with AI. And I'm sure that you have a lot of things that you would like to mention about that yourself.
Yeah, well, we can get into that, but it's a good segue from the Jumbotron because I believe the CEO was responsible for an AI company, wasn't it? So that's a good jumping off point to talk to you. One of the feedback I've had from our first podcast, which was very popular, by the way, and it's
Well,
getting a
I'm
lot of
glad.
downloads, which so thank you
I'm
for
glad.
that.
Sure.
The feedback that I'm getting is, could Phyllis talk a little bit more about your records retention schedule? And the question is, if that's a document that's got all the types of records you have, where they're located, what format they're in, what destruction timeline they have, and I guess one of the most crucial things is their sensitivity, as how important and confidential is the information inside each of those records. Would that be a good starting point for let's wrap our arms around what our AI can access and it can't access? And maybe that schedule is the best place to start pointing AI to the things it should and should not be looking at. How have you seen that in your
Yeah. Well, that is actually a good jumping off point.
yeah.
And the records retention schedule, as we know, is the foundation of everything that we do from an information governance perspective. So I think that I've mentioned previously that we work with a database of about 350,000 citations, which are global citations. They're basically for every industry globally, every jurisdiction, and every functional area, every department. And without a proper records retention schedule, in the case of litigation, the courts would consider the client arbitrary. However, if they are using the retention schedule and are destroying their records, whether they be electronic, physical, or what other format, at the right juncture, if the documents are asked for during discovery, they would not have to be shown because they were destroyed properly. So that's very important. And clean data is what's getting us to AI. So that's why clean data, starting with the records retention schedule, is so important because AI does not want to have hallucinations. We don't want that. But if the data is not clean, and for example, if a corporation has an agreement and the Office of Records should be maintaining the agreement itself and the proper addenda associated with it. However, if many other departments and functional areas have the same document and they are not the Office of Record, that could also appear in the database. Is it the right iteration and so forth? And there you go. We don't have clean data. So going back to the foundation of the records retention schedule and the maintenance of it, that's the only way that a firm can actually be assured of having clean data for all the AI processes that they would be going into. Is that the type of thing that you were looking for, Bruce?
Yeah, that's one part of it. So for example, in a data sense, I wrote an article on LinkedIn and it was only published this week. And it talked about the amount of data cleanup that I had to do to put in an AI invoice processing system. Now, you would think that invoice processing, pretty stock standard, simple, end-to-end process. Everyone does it. Everybody knows the process. It's been around for donkey's years. The project that I did, the AI part of it was only about that big. But when you took at documents and data, this particular company had, I think about 6.5 to 7,000 suppliers on their records, and some of them they hadn't traded with for 10 years, but they were still holding information about these companies that they had previously traded with that they no longer needed to have that data. And so the problem when you've got information sitting there idle like that is that, it opens up an opportunity for fraud because people could submit an invoice, a fraudulent invoice. It's an active supplier on your books. Someone might just approve it thinking it was a legitimate invoice. It's all that kind of stuff. So we cleaned up and we destroyed, in your language, records for over 4,000, I think it was 4,200 and something in the end, suppliers that were no longer required to keep and hold their information in our finance systems and our archives and all that for audits and all the sorts of things that finance need to keep records for. So the problem with AI is AI doesn't care. It just looks across your database and says, well, there's a document. I'll cite it. I'll reference it. I'll use it in
Yes.
my query that you've asked me about. And then you can end up with some, as you mentioned, hallucinations, but old, obsolete information that was no longer relevant today gets included in the output of an
Yeah.
AI generated request. And what happens to that output? Well, that moves into the information chain and it goes off to another person or another department, or is used either in a report or it's used to make a decision. And there we have our problem right there. So the other point is securing our data. So if we have the records retention schedule and it tells us what's sensitive and what's not. We had a situation here in Australia only 2 months ago, and I only heard
Mhm.
about this because of the company that I know about. I know someone that experienced this and they work there. So it's not a public incident. So I can't tell you which company it was, but let's say it was like a Fortune 500 company. They deployed Microsoft Copilot right across the company, which was about 9,000 employees. And they said, hey, everybody, here's Copilot. How good is this? Use it, knock yourselves out. What they didn't think about, and this is where the records retention schedule comes in, about giving it access to confidential employee information. So people could go into
Oh,
Copilot and ask it a question. Hey, Phyllis, how much do you earn? What is your
oh,
salary? And so that I can imagine your records retention schedule will be pretty useful in securing information that should otherwise be kept private, even though it's stuff you have to keep for legal reasons. So that's where the intersection of AI and information governance crosses, right? So what are you seeing in that space?
well, that's interesting. So to develop a records retention schedule, one has to do a number of things. The first is put together a questionnaire for every department within an organization. Sometimes people might want to start with a pilot and want to do just one department, but let's say that we're going to be doing the whole enterprise. So we put together a questionnaire with the steering committee. We have a steering committee of the C-suite and representatives of all the departments. We put together questions that we think that we need to develop the retention schedule and additional policy and procedures. And then the client also offers some other things they would like to find out at the same time. Then we put something together. We use SurveyMonkey. We use some other type of survey vehicle. Doesn't matter. We introduce this to the complement of people we are going to be interviewing, so they won't be surprised. And also, we make sure that a senior representative of the C-suite says, yes, we're endeavoring to do this process, so please be available. When we get the questionnaire back, that helps us develop record series and record types that every department maintains. However, we also find that lots of the departments don't really include everything that they have because you need electronic, you need physical. They might even have old microfilm and microfiche. They might have voice recordings. They might have media and all sorts of things. So we want to make sure that all of that is maintained. So when the interview takes place, we don't just take what the client says, but we also are knowledgeable about every department vis-a-vis the 350,000 citations, which I mentioned. So then we add to it. Then we actually do the legal research from the citations, from other things, governing bodies, also industry-specific bodies and so forth. And to that point, the retention schedule is developed. We then give it back to the client for their legal department, outside counsel to take a look at and check. Oftentimes they don't check, but we're sure about what we do. And then from there, we develop policy and procedures, which departments utilize the same records, workflow, all sorts of other things. So then we deliver the retention schedule, and then we also develop the policy and procedures, do a staff training and program rollout, and then after that, do a couple of additional things. One is get rid of the redundant, obsolete, and trivial information from the electronic database. And two is for the actual physical files, if they still have them, make sure that they are purged, and the only documents that remain are the ones for the Office of Record that actually has a retention period that goes onward. And if one does all of these things, including any microfilm, microfiche, any other technologies, round reel tapes, whatever that they might have, then you have something that you can actually put into an AI situation because you have clean data. And that's what we endeavor to do. And
Yeah.
that's the process.
So the example I can give you is again from Microsoft Copilot, and that if you read the guidelines and the responsible use policies that Microsoft provide with their software, it is that it works best in an environment where your information is structured. So what I've seen in companies, particularly with SharePoint, and the advent of these other tools like Teams, where you can create Teams sites, that when organizations haven't had structure around those particular tools, people have created their own sites and their own
Mhm.
document repositories. And I think at one company that I worked with had 650 Microsoft Access databases that
Wow.
staff had created. It was a big company over many years. Another one was they create these SharePoint sites for projects, for all these different purposes, but there's no naming conventions, there's no rigor around them. It was just Jeff's folder or
Mm,
Jocelyn's, document
I've seen
list or
like
whatever.
that. Yeah.
You put AI over the top of all of these, 600 access databases. You've got millions of, I will say millions of Word documents and Excel spreadsheets that people have accumulated over many, many years. And then it's got to try to interpret all of that and come up with an answer. And a human couldn't do that. And a machine makes an attempt at doing that, but it's going to be a very probabilistic guess. And I think that's the reckoning that's coming. I don't think that people realize what they're sitting on top of. I mean, they know they've got lots of data and it's a mess, but I don't think they understand the ramifications of it.
There's a lot more unstructured data than structured data, absolutely. But that's why we go into these additional processes after we do
Yeah.
the training, because we have to get rid of the rot, and we have to make sure that, during discovery you can't find something that really should have been tossed a long time ago. And that's why the retention schedule is always the Bible and the foundation of everything that we do. And as I said, it really helps clean the data, because without clean data, where are we?
Yeah.
And yeah, so this is just the very beginning. But what I'm talking about are the processes that I've used for years. Of course, we didn't have that
Mm.
much electronic. It was much more round reel tapes. I mean, I was around when there was IBM 360s and 370s when I was a kid,
Yeah.
so I've really seen the advent of all of these things. But that's why information governance and AI governance is so important these days, because that's the only way that we can really get the data the way that we need it to be to do all the discovery that's so important. And everyone's going into AI, but towards what end? And how much information do they have? And how well have they been trained? And what are corporations doing with training their staff and so forth and so on? So it really is a huge undertaking, and it's the thing that I guess we're asked about the most, but we still are very strict as far as the foundations which we set
Mhm.
with the life cycle that I just explained.
Yeah. So can you help our listeners understand? So let's say, for example, we've kept a document that, according to the records retention schedule, should have been destroyed. And that document is still sitting there. And what would be the circumstances upon which that document was then surfaced in a legal sense that would cause that organization to have a problem? What would be a good example of that for people to help them understand?
A good example of that could be an employment contract, for example. Our country, I'm sure most countries are very litigious by nature now. So if an employee felt that they were wrongly let go 12 years ago and they decided they had a friend who was had some other slip and fall law case, and because there are groups of people who actually just look for that. So they said, you know what? Maybe they really didn't, use best practice when they got rid of me. So normally the retention schedule for an employee file with various caveats, but just per se would be 7 years. But if that person came back in a number of years later and it was still there, then there you go, that it's still there, and then the firm could absolutely be in the soup because that document was still there and provided, as opposed to being tossed when it should have been with the proper. And also, when documents are destroyed, one also issues certificates of destruction, so that ends the paper trail, and you can actually see that this classified document with this classification and so forth was destroyed on this date pertinent to the retention schedule. So again, there's always a paper trail, and the certificate of destruction is the end piece. But as I say, if the document is still there, then it is discoverable, and the company would be liable, where they wouldn't have been if they would have followed their procedures.
Mhm. Well, that's almost like a statute of limitations, right? On
Very, very similar, of
it
course.
just puts the company in a safe position. If anything happens beyond that period, it creates a limitation for their liability, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Now,
Mm.
there's also some caveats. So, for example, if the retention period is 7 years for any type of document, and the firm decides that they want to keep the record for 10 years, if they have a very good business reason and they can explain that to us or whomever is preparing their schedule, then certainly it will become 10 years. It can never be less than 7 years, but it can be more if there's a good policy for that. So there are some caveats associated with that.
Yeah, the one of the interesting things we spoke about this last time was that when you're working with vulnerable children, that those records, I think they're a lifetime now, that that an organization has to keep records for such a long period of time and to
Yeah,
keep them safe and secure for that time.
definitely. Well, there are also records that we would call vital records, which is usually about 3% of records maintained. Everything from board meeting minutes, to foundation records of the company when it was first begun and so forth. So those records can be kept in perpetuity, and that's a permanent record. So those records can be scanned, or they actually could physically be kept in a box. However, these days, because of climate conditions such as they are, everything really should be scanned, because that way at least it would be a permanent record. And
Yeah.
that's actually why people still use microfilm and microfiche, because that actually is still, for example, for pharmaceutical records, for that industry, a lot of the records still are maintained on microfilm and microfiche because that might last longer. Because, of course, you would have everything within the AI system. However, records also have to be dispersed to be legally defensible. So you would want a second copy of whatever iteration someplace else, in which case you would have a different form of media for that.
Well, I could
Lot,
imagine that. Yeah.
lots of rules.
I could imagine in that pharmaceutical industry, when you've got drugs that are being developed and that they may take 4 or 5, 10 years for those side effects to show up.
Right.
and there may be problems down the road with those drugs, that company must have good records and be able to retain them so that if should anything happen or that they can access those and reference them if when needed.
One of my largest clients through the years has been a pharmaceutical company that is a global company and so forth. And yes, interestingly enough, I did a lot of projects for them, one of which was in Antwerp, and they had one of the largest physical repositories that I've ever seen. This was just the advent of electronic document management. And there was one old gentleman who knew where everything was, but that was about it. So
Mm,
getting him to like give us the keys to the kingdom so we could
mm,
start developing something was almost impossible. But
mm.
interestingly enough, it was the rows were so long and so forth. We had some kids who were retrieving documents for us on skateboards. That was the only way that they could actually, get to things
Yeah.
quickly enough, and it was quite something, but he was able to get us the information that we needed, and he retired very shortly thereafter. But I've
Mm,
seen a lot of different, very, very large paper-based situations because I've been in the industry for 40 years and everything was
mm,
physical in those days. So, yeah, seen
yeah.
very, very interesting things through the years.
Well, we had to, and coming back to, going through the IBM 360 days and coming into, I remember when electronic storage was expensive. So email attachments had to be removed, and from an electronic perspective, you actually had to purge documents that, if you had 14 versions of a document, you actually had to purge 13 of them to only keep the final version, which was the one that was ultimately published. So you couldn't keep versions. Now we've got versions of everything. And we've had this exponential explosion in documents. And at the same time, we've had an explosion of what's kept, and because the storage has been cheap. And there was a natural constraint, I guess you could call it, on document storage that encouraged good practice. And that's changed over the last 20 years significantly.
It
Mm,
it ha it's still very strange to me, though, walking into offices and still seeing banks of filing cabinets and actually see a lot of HR records that are just, like, there in
mm,
warehouses, and there might be something on the box, written on the box saying this surname to that surname, and, if somebody was there on a Saturday and nobody was there, they could look. I mean,
yeah,
so there's still a lot of things that
yeah,
you would think at 2026 it would not be happening, but it still
mm,
is, and
yeah,
a lot of the things that I saw when I was a kid starting out is still there. So, yes, the advent of AI is changing things, but at least in our lifetime, there's still going to be boxes on shelves at record centers. There's no doubt in my mind about that.
yeah. So one of the challenges is trying to take these paper documents and scanning them. Now, that's a very much a human task. So we put it through the scanner, and then somebody's got to look at that document and determine all the attributes around that document. So, what are you seeing in the AI space around automation of some of that document scanning?
Most of it can be automated now, and the classification in the retention schedule, the actual nomenclature used and so forth, would be the same as the nomenclature on the document to be scanned. So that way it's just universal. So you would still be using the Bible of the retention schedule, giving you that information. And and there actually are lots of different types of document scanning now, a couple of which I can't talk about right now. However,
Right.
if your listeners would
Mm,
be interested in hearing more, they can reach out to me. I will still be generic, but I can give a lot
mm,
of additional information. But
yeah.
what we're talking about is something that we really do on a day-to-day basis. But the most important thing is to use the same nomenclature, and the nomenclature is exactly what the Office of Record uses. So if an ancillary department, this is a silly example, but rather than say employee files, they might say staff files. You would want to make sure what the Office of Records nomenclature is, and that's what the identifying criteria would be. throughout,
mm.
and that's very important.
Yeah, the process of digitizing those documents is somewhat critical because that point in time, that's when you can make a decision. Do we need to keep this or not?
Yes.
And if you were to then destroy it, you can create that certificate. And that way you've got
Yeah.
a record that it's been destroyed, but you don't have to keep that document. One of the things that came to mind as you were speaking about scanning was the Anthropic. Do you know Anthropic? They're the company that
Yes, sure.
it's created Fable 5, which is the famous, machine that can break into any system in the world. Well, what they've been doing lately, and it was very covert operation, was they've been buying up all the old books and having a background in English literature. I think your heart will be broken when you hear what they did with them. They cut off the spines and they scanned them into their model, and then they recycled the paper that was left over. So you're talking about rare, old.
I actually was told that last week by a
Mm,
company that actually does that. And they said the same thing to me, knowing my background. And I mentioned that one of my clients through the years was John Wiley and Sons,
yeah.
and the actual progeny of the original Wiley. They had an office in New Jersey that I did a lot of work in, and they had rare first editions, which obviously they kept. And for someone like me, I was like a kid in a candy store. It was wonderful. But yes,
Yeah,
somebody else said the same thing to me
yeah,
about cut. Yeah, last week,
yeah,
and
yeah.
yeah,
What's your take on it?
it hurts. It
Yeah, yeah.
it hurts. I mean, it reminds me of, of like centuries ago with the libraries and so forth and what happened there. I mean, it's just yeah, it's horrible, but
Mm,
there are not that many archivists left in this world. Like most states
mm,
have archivists, but like our government in the US is not necessarily following best practice for everything from an information governance point of view. Because I'm involved with a lot of societies and so forth for for governance and our government, and our current regime is not necessarily giving what's really necessary to the most
mm.
important assets that anyone has, which is information. So that's very hurtful to people like me in my industry.
Yeah, I think, well, there's a recent guidance put out by the federal government about AI, and I think if you read the footnote, it says that responsible AI is the responsibility of the company. There was no regulation. They weren't going to regulate the suppliers of AI and put any guardrails around it. It was just, it's really the companies has to take care of this problem themselves. And if you
Well,
think about that, what that's going to look like,
not to get too political, Bruce, but
yeah,
hopefully when we have a new administration, we might go back to
mm,
further regulations, and not just
mm,
about what we're talking about, but just in
yeah,
general,
yeah,
because we live and die by regulations as
mm,
far as information governance is concerned.
mm,
And of course, we don't want to be overregulated, but there's all such a thing as being underregulated as well.
mm,
So it's a fine line. I
yeah,
mean, this topic. I mean, I've been involved in it for over 40 years, and I'm still finding it so interesting. And
mm,
of course, with the advent of AI, it's a whole new world. But a lot of the tenets, a lot of the foundations that we've been talking about today, and during our last discussion will absolutely bear fruit for many decades to come.
it's universal. What?
Yes.
So just coming back to that scanning of the books and recycling the paper. The reason why, and you'll see the irony in this, Phyllis, I'm sure. The reason why they're doing that is because the internet and the existing sources of data that they needed to train the models has been so infiltrated with AI slop that they were not getting good data to train. So they had to go to the best available source, which was books written 100 years ago.
Yes.
Isn't that ironic?
Yeah, it's also very sad, but yes,
Yeah.
it is ironic, and now they're building scanners that actually, if you have just this paper, you don't have to individually insert. You could actually somehow it just reads everything. So there's all sorts of other technology available and
Mm.
so forth. But yeah, but getting rid of the books, I mean, that's getting rid of
Yeah.
history. It's just
Yeah, yeah, it's appalling. LinkedIn, for example, and Facebook and YouTubes of this world are culling some of this auto-generated AI slop, as they call it, because it's diminishing from the quality of the good people out there who are writing and producing content that gets lost in all of this noise. And with the ability to automate things, its volume is kind of the number one thing for some of these companies, because the more you see it, the more, clicks they get, the more money they make. So it's a perverse incentive. And this is a sort of an example where I bought something from a company here in Australia, and the product was defective. And because the product was heavy, it was some batteries for a home storage battery for whenever the power went out. So I bought all these batteries online. In their terms and conditions, they said if the batteries were defective, they would happily take them back. Now, I found that the batteries were defective. I got them tested by a company who confirmed that. I provided all the information to them, and they refused to take them back. And they just continued to ignore my requests. And on Google, I wrote a negative review explaining what I'd been through using the Google recommendations service. Next thing, a few weeks later, I looked at it, I saw that there'd been 50 people that had viewed that, and I hope those 50 chose not to use that company. But what I found since I put that negative review up, there was 1,000 fake positive reviews that had been swamped
wow.
that. So unless you specifically filtered for negative reviews of that company, all you would see would be positive reviews. So the whole thing was a scam. And I think that's the problem now we've got with this AI and with the ability to generate things quickly and easily, that we're being inundated with this volume of slop that it's making it hard to work out who to trust and who the authorities are in certain spaces.
Well, as far as LinkedIn is concerned, obviously you and I, write
Mm.
our postings from whole cloth, but you
Yeah,
can actually tell when somebody uses AI, and
yeah,
LinkedIn tries to find it, but they can't find everything.
yeah.
And also, being a college professor, and I mean, there is various technology to see now if the students are actually writing it themselves or using AI. AI is going to be using more watermarks and so forth but yeah, it's and then you actually see some posts and it says generated by me with the help of AI. So who the heck is
Mm.
even going to read that post? But people are actually, and I see that a lot
Mm.
now. And yeah, which is
Yeah,
crazy. I mean,
yeah.
yeah, but yeah. So unfortunately, yeah, it's a thing now.
Mm.
And yeah,
All right. So one of the things I didn't do with you last time, which is I've been keen to do with you again, and this podcast this is a little book, one of my favorite books. Can you read that?
yes, it
Now
happens to go over. Right.
we're keeping this family oriented show, but in this book, it's a book of quotes, and it's meant to be, when bad things happen to you, you read one of the quotes and they're uplifting. So there's 150 quotes. So if you could give me a number between 1 and 150, I'll share with you what that quote is, and you can tell me what that means for you.
149.
149. Wow. Phyllis, here you go. I think you'll like this one. Tough times never last. Tough people do.
What it means to me is that life is very difficult these days, but one has to just overcome and always see the positive. And in that way, one can live a very positive life. I think we've all gone through many adversities in our lives, but I do believe if you project positivity into the universe, you get it back. So I love what I chose with number 149 because that's very much a mantra for me. My days are difficult, personally speaking, with health issues of relatives and so forth, but we have a job to do. And as long as
Mm.
one maintains positivity throughout the world and throughout one's interactions, works out well. perfect
Mm.
for me, actually.
Yeah.
Thank you. I
Yes.
appreciate that. That was
Yeah.
wonderful.
Yeah. You've had your own health challenges over the years, which you've
Yes,
overcome significantly.
yes,
And
I absolutely have.
mm,
And I'm actually, and my sister-in-law all of a sudden has a bunch of maladies, and I'm actually helping her through it right now also, as
yeah,
I helped her brother, my deceased husband, live
yeah,
12 years longer than he should have done. So,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
that
Good
is
on
true.
you.
Thank
So
you for remembering that.
that's quite okay. It's one of the fun things to do. So thank you for listening, everyone out there. You've been listening to Phyllis Elin, and she's had decades of senior information governance leadership. She works with higher education, financial services, manufacturing, healthcare, pharmaceuticals, and public sector services. And she's a renowned expert on information governance, and she can now proudly say that she's going to be on the Times Square Jumbotron for the second time in her career. So thank you for joining us, Phyllis.
Thank you for asking, Bruce. It was my pleasure again. Thank you.